My name is Asia Hadley, and I'm the training coordinator at the Foundation Center Atlanta. Welcome to What You Need to Know About Fiscal Sponsorship, presented in collaboration with Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Let me start by telling you a little bit about who we are. The Foundation Center is a national nonprofit headquartered in New York. Our mission is to strengthen the nonprofit sector by advancing knowledge about U.S. philanthropy. Our work connects nonprofits and grant makers supporting them to tools they can use and information they can trust. We maintain the most comprehensive database on U.S. grant makers and their grants, and operate research and education and training programs designed to advance philanthropy at every level. Each day, thousands of people access our free resources at our website and our library learning centers at any one of our nearly 400 cooperating collections across the country. The Foundation Center Atlanta is one of those library learning centers. We've been serving Atlanta and the Southeast from our location downstairs on the main floor of the Hurt Building since 1994. We invite you to use our library to locate information about grant makers, their grants, and all things related to effective grant making and grant seeking. Now on to today's speaker. Rachel Spears is Executive Director of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Prior to joining Pro Bono Partnership, Rachel was an associate at King & Spalding in Atlanta. She graduated from Davidson College in 1993 with a degree in political science and received her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law in 1997. Prior to attending law school, Rachel worked in the offices of U.S. Congressman John Lewis and of then U.S. Congressman Don Johnson in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Spears.
Thank you, Asia. I got applauded and I haven't even said anything. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today. I want to thank the Foundation Center and Asia for having me back. Before I get started on the topic we're going to cover today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our organization, if I can get this going. Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is a nonprofit, and our mission is to provide free legal services to other nonprofit organizations. We do that by matching you with volunteer attorneys from corporations and law firms in the Atlanta area. We don't represent individuals, we just represent nonprofits on your business law matters. Some examples of the types of things we do are register trademarks, revise bylaws, draft board policies, review personnel policies and employee handbooks. We do a lot of contract work, drafting, negotiating contracts, all sorts of things that your nonprofit might need. In order to be eligible for our services, you must be a nonprofit 501c3 organization, primarily serving the poor and disadvantaged, and unable to pay for legal services without significant impairment of program resources. So we don't have kind of a cap on your budget, but generally speaking, these are smaller community-based nonprofits that serve the poor. When it comes to startups, because a lot of us ask about getting assistance with a 501c3 application, at this time we are not representing startup organizations. We have done so in the past, but with our limited resources right now we need to focus on those that already have 501c3 status, frankly. If you want more information, you can visit us on the website, www.pbpatl.org. And I've got a whole slew of interns in the back row, so for those of you here today, you can ask our interns or myself after the presentation. That's who we are. Any questions before we get started about Pro Bono Partnership? I've got several clients in the room too, so you can ask them as well. All right, well, let's start with a basic question. What is a fiscal sponsor? Let's make sure we're all on the same page here. Generally speaking, a fiscal sponsor is an organization that has its 501c3 status. It agrees to accept donations on behalf of another organization, or in some cases an individual, that does not have 501c3 status. In that way, the donations can be tax deductible to the donor. It's very important that the fiscal sponsor not just act as a pass-through, however. It's not a situation where I give to Allison's organization, and she turns around and gives it to Andy's organization without any sort of control or any sort of oversight. You cannot do it that way. There has to be some sort of supervision and oversight over the funds. It's interesting because the IRS, as far as I know, the tax code doesn't talk about this concept of fiscal sponsorships. But this is sort of developed as an acceptable way to do this as long as you meet these requirements. One of which is that it can't be just a pass-through. And the other is that the fiscal sponsor has to make sure that the funds are used in a way that promotes their mission, the mission of the 501c3. That's true of any funds that a 501c3 organization spends. It has to promote their mission. So even if you are giving it to another organization, you have to make sure they're using it in a way that promotes your mission, not their mission. And we'll talk about that some more. But I want to stop here and get an idea of the audience we're dealing with. I'm going to ask you a few questions, just get a sense for where you're coming at this from. So please raise your hand if you have a 501c3 organization. Okay, so a good number of you maybe have been approached about becoming a fiscal sponsor for another organization, is that right? And you're seeing what that entails. Well, good, we'll give you some information about that. How many of you are looking to start a nonprofit organization? Okay, we've got a few, and maybe are interested in the possibility of finding a fiscal sponsor. Okay, and do we have any individuals, maybe artists, filmmakers that are looking for using fiscal sponsorship that way? None in this group. Well, that's not my area of expertise, so that's good. We're going to focus more on the situation with nonprofits looking for fiscal sponsors. And I'm also going to pause here and give my personal opinion about this topic, which may make me unpopular with some of you, but I think it's on topic here. And that is whether or not to go and get your own 501c3 status. I know a lot of people use fiscal sponsors as maybe a stepping stone to getting your own 501c3 status. I really encourage any of you thinking about starting a nonprofit to look at other options to going out and getting your own 501c3. Getting a fiscal sponsor sort of on a temporary basis is one thing. Other things I would encourage you to do is talk to other programs, look into working with them, bringing your program to them, working with them as an employee or an active volunteer. Before you go out and set up a new 501c3 organization, I really want to encourage you to make sure that you know what you're getting into. For those of you in the room that have done that, you can tell them how difficult a path that is. We have actually something that was filmed here, Myths and Realities of Starting a Nonprofit, which is available on the Foundation Center website. I encourage you to view that. I think you'll get a good dose of what reality is in starting a nonprofit organization. I don't want to discourage people from following, what they feel called to do. I just want to make sure they know what they're getting into before they go down that road. And in the interest of making sure they succeed, I want them to have done the homework. What we encourage people to do is, number one, to get a business plan. I think that's the most important thing. Get a good business plan in place that lists all of your expenses, realistically what the expenses are going to be, and then identifies funding sources. And when I say funding sources, I don't mean writing down that we'll ask the Coca-Cola Foundation money and we hear Woodruff has some money. I mean identifying organizations that fund programs like yours, that fund startup organizations, because many of them do not. The reality is, in those first few years, most foundations are not going to look at you, so you need to identify how you're going to fund that in the interim, which is oftentimes family and friends. And for startup organizations, as many of you in this room know, you're going to be funding it by yourself out of your own pocketbook for quite some time probably. And for those organizations that come to me and put in their budget a big fat salary for them, I have to ask them whether that's really realistic. So I think that's a reality you need to be aware of if you're looking to start a nonprofit organization, tax-exempt organization. Like I said, it's my personal opinion. A lot of people don't listen to me. but I encourage you to look at alternatives to running out and starting a 501c3, which includes, like I said, getting a fiscal sponsor. Any questions before I get off my little high horse? Yes?
My name is Fred Huber. I'm with the Grant Park Neighborhood Association.
Great.
And we are fiscal sponsors to several entities right now. I'm interested in the second point in here about retaining supervision and control. We actually have our treasurer with us as well. Does that mean that we need to put things up for a vote on the board, as like when, say, the Friends of Grant Park Pool raise money for the pool, and we put it into their separate bank account that we retain control of? Do we need to have then a board vote and minutes that show that we approved the release of those funds for a specific project?
We are going to get into more specifics in just a minute. But generally speaking, you don't need to have a board vote every time you send them a check. No, but you need to make sure you are having them report back to you on how they're spending the funds and things like that. We can talk more about that for sure. Any other questions before we get into the meat of this? Okay. All right, so why would you have a fiscal sponsor? If you're coming at this from the project, the organization that does not have 501c3 status, what are the benefits? Well, obviously, the first is that you are able to receive tax-deductible donations. Obviously, you're going to have more success in getting donations if they are tax-deductible to the donor, and this is a great way to accomplish that. Another benefit is if your program lacks staff and resources, by coming up under another organization, you can structure it in such a way that to benefit from their staff. You can be under their administrative functions like bookkeeping, and even in their kind of development office, maybe get some support from them. I mentioned before that a lot of foundations and donors are wary of funding startup organizations. They know about the success rates and maybe feel more comfortable of funding organizations that have a proven track record. So you might find more access to donations by partnering with an established organization. It also adds credibility to an organization that, again, has no track record. So obviously those that could benefit from a fiscal sponsor are those organizations that maybe have an idea and want to try it out but aren't sure whether this is going to really succeed in the long term. It's a way to just kind of try it out without running out and paying that $7 or $50 for a 501c3 application. Groups that are just operating for a short time, maybe there's a particular issue that you are concerned about, a political issue that is only a short-term kind of issue and then may be resolved. You can set up this organization just for the short time period. Those groups that don't have a lot of experience in running nonprofits can benefit from it. And as I said earlier, individuals, this is used often, and I think with independent filmmakers who get fiscal sponsors in order to raise money to produce films. So if you're looking for a fiscal sponsor, what do you need to keep in mind? As I said earlier, a 501c3 has to make sure that their funds are expended in a way consistent with their mission. So obviously you need to find a fiscal sponsor whose mission is consistent with yours. If you are looking to open an animal shelter, then your friend with the after-school program, 501c3, is probably not going to be able to help you. So look for a similar mission. Look for an organization that has done fiscal sponsorships before, has worked with projects like yours before, that has some experience in this area. You want to make sure it's an organization that has the financial resources and staff in order to fulfill their responsibilities of oversight. I have a lot of clients who have just gotten their 501c3 status, and immediately all of their friends are asking them to be their fiscal sponsor because, oh, you got your 501c3 status, will you sponsor me? I really strongly discourage them from doing that because if you are starting up a new nonprofit, you've got your hands full. You don't need to be taking on that additional responsibility, and we'll talk about that later. It'd be nice to find a sponsor that has a history of support, financial support from funders, and strong policies and procedures in place so that they can do their job effectively. Fiscal sponsors, in addition to offering you this way to bring in tax-deductible contributions, many of them have become really, shops where you can get lots of different things. I've got this handout that was on the table with references. These are a couple of these organizations that provide a whole package. They may be able to help you with, like I said earlier, your bookkeeping, your financial records. They may be able to provide you with insurance coverage, human resources administration, including payroll processing, which I must say is very important. I've seen a lot of nonprofits get in trouble not doing payroll correctly, not taking payroll taxes out correctly. So no matter what you do, make sure that you get assistance with that. And they can help with general administration as well. For the fiscal sponsor, there can be benefits as well as risk that I want to make sure you're aware of. Benefits to an organization can be just bringing in new donors, making more people aware of your organization through this new project. If the project is successful, you get to take in some of the credit for that. And you may have been interested in expanding into projects beyond what you're already doing now, but haven't had the staff and the resources to do that. And this can be a way of doing that effectively. You also have to be aware of the risk. You may have some legal responsibility for the project. If there's liability involved, if there's someone gets injured on the project, you need to think about what the risks are to your own organization. You are, like I said earlier, the IRS will hold you accountable for the use of all donations to make sure they're used in a way that's consistent with your mission. So you need to make sure that you are doing that. And if you're not doing that, and if it's used in a way that's not consistent with your mission, you are potentially putting your own tax-exempt status at risk. So worst case scenario, you could lose your tax-exempt status. And as a 501c3, is there anything more important to you than that? So the risk can be significant. Yes?
Are there any differences between cash running through the sponsorship versus stuff? Like if some equipment is donated or some materials are donated that's going to then be used for other programs or whatever. Is there any difference whether it's cash that goes through versus like a valuation on that stuff? Does that are these questions?
I would say whatever the resources you bring in, you have to make sure they're used in a way that's consistent with your mission, whether it's cash or in-kind donations. Is that the question?
I don't know if it's a chain of custody type thing. If it's something of value like an automobile.
Well, automobiles are a totally different thing simply because the IRS has rules about donations of automobiles, specifically because there's been so much abuse in that area. So I won't get into automobiles.
Building materials.
Okay. So you bring them in as a 501c3 organization and turn them over to another organization that does not have their own 501c3 status. And you give the donor of those building materials an acknowledgement saying thank you for the building materials, which they use to take a tax donation, as long as the project that you're giving the materials to uses it in a manner that's consistent with your mission, building homes for the less fortunate or something, then that's fine. Does that get at it?
Yeah, I guess the last question is does it matter how that value is derived for those materials?
Now, why are you deriving the value?
The owner of a property wants to get rid of this stuff. They don't want to pay to get it taken care of, so they'll donate it.
Right.
Their incentive is for the value to be as high as possible.
Well.
Is there a competing incentive to keep it as low as possible?
Now we're getting into another topic, which is acknowledgments of charitable donations. And what you need to know about that is with in-kind donations, I hope my clients know this. If somebody gives you an in-kind donation that's something other than cash, when you send them an acknowledgement, you do not put a value on that. You say, thank you for the building materials. It is up to the donor to determine the value. Now, at the risk of confusing you, when it comes to doing your audit, you may want to include the value of in-kind donations as revenue into your organization, but you want to make sure that you do that with your audit on your own. You don't provide that information to the donor.
But are those values linked in any ways between what I assume they are and the other person assumes?
That's up to them to do. You don't get that information from them. All right. Have I confused y'all? Allison, do you have a question?
Yeah. We have polo ponies donated to us, and people can take up to $5,000 off, but we don't know, we wouldn't be privileged to know what they deem their value, or would we? And that's how we could.
For purposes of your audit?
Yes.
For purposes of your audit, when you're trying to figure that out, you might ask them. But I'm saying you're not putting in writing down what they should deduct.
Okay,
That's up to them. Yeah, you can ask them, but it's not important that you have to have those numbers match. I mean, it's not important that you have to go into that detail. If you're trying to figure it out for your purposes, you can ask them what they've estimated at. All right, is everybody following along? Okay. Okay, so we've identified some potential risk. Now for the project. Again, the benefits of doing this allow the project to focus on what you want to do in the first place. For those of you that have a passion, there's something you really want to accomplish, by just doing it as a project rather than setting up a whole new 501c3 nonprofit organization, this allows you to focus on your mission rather than all the administrative pieces of it that goes along with having a 501c3. And you can really benefit from this relationship with a sponsor if you get a good sponsor. Also, if you try this project and it's not working, it's pretty easy to terminate it without having to go through the process of dissolving a nonprofit corporation and notifying the IRS. Cons. I think this discourages a lot of people from taking my advice and going a route other than starting their own 501c3. There is a loss of autonomy. You're going to have someone with oversight over your organization. Also, it's important to note that some funders also won't give to your organization through a fiscal sponsor. So before you go this route, you need to identify who your funders are going to be and whether they have any restrictions on this sort of arrangement. All right, before I get into the specifics of what you should have in a fiscal sponsorship agreement, do I have any other questions so far? Yes?
Okay, so does the, what do you call the agency that is?
The fiscal sponsor or the project? Let's call it a project just to be consistent.
Is the project bound by the same guidelines as the 501c3 as far as financial management goes?
Well, it's a good question. What we're talking about, these are guidelines of the IRS. And for a project that's not a 501c3 organization, you know, they're not under that from the IRS as a 501c3. So it really are guidelines that govern the 501c3 organization, but the project needs to be aware of them because they affect them as well.
But it would affect the fiscal agent, right?
The fiscal sponsor, the 501c3 organization, yeah, it absolutely affects them.
If the project is not abiding by the rules of the 501c3, then...
It absolutely does, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in this case, the 501c3 has to be very aware of what the project is doing because it can absolutely impact their 501c3 status. Mm-hmm. Was there another question? Yeah.
Just in terms of the permanency, you can move from being just a simple project after years of having a fiscal sponsor and getting 501c3.
Yes.
And not be bound. Okay.
You can. I mean, you can use this as a temporary thing because you want to try it out. You're not sure how it's going to go, so you get a fiscal sponsor. Things go well, and then you decide to get your 501c3 status later. Now, there are some things to keep in mind. If you get incorporated, then if you then apply for 501c3 status, and I'm not up on all this, but I think it's within 27 months of your date of incorporation, then your 501c3 status is going to be retroactive back to your date of incorporation. So there's incentive to, once you get incorporated, to go ahead and file for 501c3 status within 27 months. So that's just a warning. If you want to get incorporated as a nonprofit, get a fiscal sponsor, and then 5 years later you decide, oh, it's time to get 501c3 status, it may not be retroactive back to the date of incorporation, which might not be a problem. It's just something you need to be aware of before you go that route. Did I see another question? Yes?
Just nuts and bolts question. Donors, who do they make the check out to? The project or the fiscal sponsor?
That's a good question. We're about to get into the nuts and bolts. So let's do that now, unless there's anything else just about the basics. Okay. All right, so wait, did I miss anything on that last slide? Yeah, so you need an agreement. Don't enter into this relationship without having something in writing, because everything may be hunky-dory now, everybody's getting along, everybody kind of feels like you know what's going on, but that can change over time, especially when money is involved. So get everything, think about how this is going to work mechanically, and get it in writing, a written agreement that sets out who is responsible for what. Yes?
Is there a website you can go to find a template?
You know, I've got some resources at the end that include some websites. I don't know if they have, I think there may be some templates on those websites. But some things you want that agreement to include. You need to set out whether this project is going to be incorporated. I think that's a good idea to have the project incorporated, because without them being a legal entity, it's kind of difficult for them to enter into a contract. So set out whether it's going to be an incorporated nonprofit that is entering into the contract. You want to talk about how these funds are going to be maintained and released to the organization. You should have the donors write the check to the 501c3 organization. And then the 501c3 organization will release the funds to the nonprofit, to the project. You need to talk about how that's going to happen logistically. Is it going to be once a month? Are they going to make a request to you, sort of a check request, here are the items we need, and then you'll write them a check for that amount? Do they need it more often? Do they need funds twice a month? Just talk with them about how that's going to work, how much notice they'll have of the funds they need. You need to find a system that doesn't take too much of your time, but also works for their needs as well. The program is going to be responsible for reporting back to you how they're spending the funds. So you need to talk to them about how that's going to work mechanically. Are they going to send you, reports quarterly that say, here are the things we spent the money on? Probably a good idea to have receipts and some other documentation with that as well. If you all, the fiscal sponsor and the project, are submitting grant applications together, jointly, you're going to want to discuss that in the agreement. Who's responsible for preparing the grant proposal? Who's responsible for doing the reports that you're going to have to give to the funder? Now, administrative fees. This is a big one. The 501c3 organization, as I mentioned, is taking on risk. They're also taking on an administrative burden. It's entirely appropriate for them to take fees out of these funds. And oftentimes it's a percentage of the money coming in is kept with the 501c3 organization before being dispersed. As far as that amount, I've seen, from 1% with very generous organizations, 10, maybe 12%. A lot of that depends on what they're offering that organization in addition to just the funds. And that can be, like I said earlier, the payroll processing and the bookkeeping and the insurance. Obviously, if they're providing those additional things, you're going to be on the high end. If they're not, if it's just a matter of the funds, it's going to be on the lower end. Yes?
I've got a question about that percentage. We're working with organizations for privates at the lower than 1%. As a professional fundraiser myself, and associated with the American Association of Fundraising Professionals, it's unethical to take a percentage. So why is it not unethical for an organization to take a percentage?
Well, let me take a stab at that. It's a good question. And for those of you that aren't aware of that, and if you didn't hear that, the Association of Fundraising Professionals states on their website it's unethical for a professional fundraiser to charge you a percentage of what they bring in for you. If they write a grant for you and it gets, $10,000 grant, they get 10% of it. That's unethical according to the AFP. Well, I would say the difference is probably because the fundraising professional is writing the grants. They are responsible for bringing that money in. And the concern is that they are going to be maybe more motivated by the percentage they're getting rather than the interest of the organization. Whereas here with a fiscal sponsor, they're not going out and collecting the money. It's the project that's going to be responsible, I assume, for getting the money in most of these cases with you.
Unless you're doing a co-application with.
Yeah, a joint application. But yeah, I think that's the difference here. It's a good question, but it's very much accepted that it's a percentage in this, and that's what I'm guessing is the difference here.
I always caution my clients against the percentage.
I do too. I agree. I think that's the best practice. But this is seen as a different duck.
The sponsor is providing a service that can be compensated for.
Yeah, and so does a fundraiser. But like I said, the fundraiser is sort of motivated to get that amount, just to increase their own amount, where the sponsor is not the one going out and getting usually the money. Yes?
Well, our organization is just entered into a fiscal sponsorship with another entity, and we charge the administrative fee based on the amount of time that we estimated our finance director would have to do extra bookkeeping, for providing them with whatever information they needed to keep their budget and so on.
So is it a percentage or is it a flat fee? How did y'all work it?
Flat fee, actually.
Okay, a flat fee no matter how much was brought in, no matter, okay. So there are organizations that do it like a flat fee. So you need to talk through that, what's going to work for your organization. Yes?
How do funders sometimes, most of the time, in my experience, will specifically say the funds are not to be used for any type of administrative fees, blah, 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 whatever. So if you have a fiscal sponsor who's taking that percentage out, how does that keep them and the project out of trouble?
You've got to disclose that to the funder at the time you're asking the funds. Say, we have a fiscal sponsor. Number one, are you okay with that? Are you still going to give us the money? And number two, you need to be aware that this is the percentage that will go to the fiscal sponsor. Before you even, finalize that application, you need that information. Any other questions about fees?
When you're writing how much of the financial information that goes on between the fiscal sponsor and the project is included in the budget of the project when they're writing for the funds? Or do you disclose any of these? I mean, if you're co-writing the grant, you might also be sharing staff as well. So
Yeah.
how is that reflected?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but you want to be as open as possible about this is how it's going to work, as far as how the funds are going to be used, and to disclose if it's shared with the fiscal sponsor. I would say be very open about all of that.
So the percentage of time that these people are working on their project and yours can be listed, and what that...
I would think the funder is going to want to know all of that. Yeah, absolutely. All right, you want to put in your agreement if the sponsor is providing other types of support. You certainly want that listed in there as well. Another issue that comes up is whether or not the project can lobby. 501c3 organizations are limited in the amount of lobbying that they can do. And the 501c3 is going to want to know whether the project's doing any lobbying, because the amount of lobbying that the project is going to be doing will be tied up with the amount of lobbying that the actual 501c3 does, in calculating whether it's what the IRS calls more than an insubstantial amount. So you want to put in there whether they can lobby, and if so, the 501c3 is going to need to know how much lobbying they're doing so that they're not exceeding what they're able to do. Yes?
Question on lobbying.
Mm-hmm.
What qualifies as lobbying, and more specifically, if you are a CDC,
Community development.
you have to lobby for your community with
Well,
both local, state, and federal officials.
this is not my lobbying workshop, but we have a whole workshop on lobbying and political campaigning, but I'll give my brief overview.
Okay.
Number one, if you're a 501c3 organization, the percentage of political campaigning that you can do, which means opposing or supporting a candidate for public office, is 0. No political campaigning. Now, separate that from lobbying. which is, and I'm not brushed up on my lobbying workshop, but supporting or opposing legislation before a legislative body. So a specific bill before Congress, for example. If you go and speak to your congressperson in support or against that, that's lobbying. It can also include grassroots efforts. If you get your members to send postcards to their representatives supporting or opposing a piece of legislation. It's a very specifically defined thing. There are lots of types of advocacy that don't fall under lobbying. But when it comes to lobbying, generally speaking, 501c3s can lobby as long as it's no more than an insubstantial amount of what they do. There's not a lot of guidance of what an insubstantial amount is. But if you're doing lobbying, it's something that you need to look further into, get some guidance on it. It may make sense for you to do something called a 501h election, which is a election that you make to the IRS, and they'll calculate your amount of lobbying a little bit differently. It gives you a little more freedom to lobby. So I tried to really briefly cover that. But be aware that lobbying is something you need to be aware of. If you're doing it, you need to find out this information. Does that help at all?
We'll take the lobbying workshop.
Yes. We'll schedule one more of those for you. So if the bottom line is you need to keep track of how much lobbying you're doing, and if you are sponsoring a project that plans to do lobbying, you need to be aware of that. And if it's easier for you to say, and the project doesn't need to do lobbying, if it's easier just to lay out that there's no lobbying, then you need to cover that in your agreement. Any comments, questions on that?
I just have one question.
Yeah.
If you have a project and you're doing something with, let's say, senior citizens, and you want to partner with a faith-based 501c, there are some restrictions with faith-based that don't exist for regular nonprofits. Like, faith-based cannot proselytize, do those kinds of things, engage in those kinds of activities. So,
According to who?
well, one of the restrictions is you can make it available, but you can't require it of your participants. You know, if Bible study is part of the effort.
And you're talking about federal dollars.
I'm talking federal dollars.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not an IRS limitation. I mean, if you set yourself up as a religious charitable organization and you want to proselytize while you provide shelter, you know, there are no IRS restrictions on that. Like she said, I think what you're talking about is if you're getting federal funding, the federal government may limit the amount that you can do.
That I can do regardless to who my sponsor, fiscal sponsor is.
So your question is, if you are not faith-based?
Yeah, the project is not faith-based.
Okay.
But the fiscal sponsor is.
Oh, so would you be able to get federal funding if it's coming through a fiscal sponsor? You're going to have to ask that question. When you're going for looking for those funds, you're going to have to ask them if that's a problem. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Operating an earned income business, is there, let's say these building materials, you want to sell some of them. Is there any kind of issues with selling stuff for fundraising? As a fiscal sponsor, is it these all separate things, or is there, if you try to monetize these materials, and or say operating a kitchen at a food kitchen, you're actually operating it as a business?
Okay, another workshop. Y'all are asking great questions, but we could be here all day.
Well, it is. You can talk to a lawyer for free.
Take advantage of it. All right, that workshop is called Revenue Generating Activities. So lots of issues come up with that when you're talking about selling services, selling goods. There's no restriction necessarily on the ability of a 501c3 nonprofit to sell services, to sell goods. What you need to look at, number one, is it consistent with your mission? Because everything needs to go back to your mission. Number two, you're going to have to look at whether you're going to have to pay taxes on that revenue. While 501c3 organizations are generally exempt from paying federal income tax, there's an exception for something called unrelated business income, UBIT or UBTI, depending on what your preference is. But basically, it's income that you receive that's unrelated to your mission. And let me give you an example. You said building materials. So what's your mission?
Our mission is just related to feeding people.
Okay.
And so one of is the opportunity to basically tear down some commercial greenhouses and reconstruct them in schools and nursing homes and other places.
In an effort to grow food, to feed people, is that?
Farming and self-sufficiency and all those things, and how the chain of food will work all the way to your stomach. But there's a lot of this stuff. So there's excess that can be packaged and sold
Okay.
as a way to help fund the project.
Without knowing all the details. So your mission is basically building greenhouses to help people feed themselves. In doing your mission, sort of an activity that comes out of that is tearing down old greenhouses, and that's where these building materials come from. Okay, I would guess that that's not related to your mission. If it's just a byproduct of you building these greenhouses and you tear down whatever's there and you end up with this stuff.
But it starts with the green. I mean, it's vital to have a roof for it to grow in areas where, like in Georgia, where.
Yeah, but let's just say you're building a greenhouse and there's something there. Maybe not even a greenhouse. There's just something there, and you got to tear it down in order to build your greenhouse. So it's
tearing the greenhouse down and moving it from a commercial location to schools or whatever.
Okay.
Maybe an owner of a property has stuff that has value. He doesn't want to pay to tear it down.
Okay.
But it has value for somebody else, and so he's looking to benefit by giving it away. Someone will come take it, tear it down.
And are you using them?
And there's a lot of them. Commercial, it's 60,000 to 70,000 square feet.
But you're reusing them.
Yes.
But so what are you selling?
Some of the greenhouse.
Oh, okay. Okay, the excess that you don't need. Okay, well, let's take two different examples. Number one is the one I mentioned where there's something there, an old garage or something. It's abandoned. You want to tear it down to build your greenhouse. Totally unrelated to what you're doing. It's just excess waste. That, I would say, is probably unrelated to your mission. And you can sell those items, but you're probably going to end up paying taxes on it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it or can't do it. And probably you're benefiting more than, you have to pay a little tax on it, but you're still benefiting enough to make it worthwhile.
Sales tax or income tax?
This is federal income tax. Let's not even get into sales tax. That's a whole other workshop. Seriously. So if it's unrelated, you're going to have to pay tax on it. If it's related to your mission, if it is, pieces of greenhouse that you couldn't use and do in your new greenhouse, but all part of kind of what you're doing, then you may be able to argue that it's related and you don't have to pay tax on it. Lots of issues of that sort. So, like I said, we talk for an hour and a half about UBIT normally, so that's a very brief thing. But as far as that ties into fiscal sponsorship agreements, I don't know how much the fiscal sponsor cares about the project selling things that are not being funded by the money coming through the fiscal sponsor. It seems to me that might be unrelated to your relationship with the fiscal sponsor.
Money, it's just stuff is moving through, and so.
Oh, because the stuff you're.
This checking account thing works, and ownership of those accounts.
So you're saying these materials that you might sell are coming through the fiscal sponsor?
That is the funding.
Okay, so they're coming through the fiscal sponsor. So the donor gets an acknowledgement from the fiscal sponsor, takes a donation, it comes to you, and then you potentially sell it.
Or the fiscal sponsorship is the one who sells it and deals with it. It's just,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying it's just pushing paper through, but it's when money then changes hand on those materials, are we dealing with the same checking account? And then, so the money has to go to that checking account and then get dispersed, or will they have their own checking account and do their own thing?
I think we're getting too far into the weeds now. So maybe we'll try to talk afterwards about that. Okay. Questions about that before I move on? Okay. Tax reporting. The 501c3 organization is going to need to fill out 990s, annual tax information returns, and the money that's coming into the fiscal sponsor for the benefit of the project is going to need to be included on that. So you're going to have to get information from your project in order to complete your 990 accurately. Okay, you need to cover if there are going to be paid employees. Are those employees of the project or are they employees of the fiscal sponsor? That's going to be important. Who's paying payroll taxes? How much supervision is the sponsor going to have? Is it going to be just enough to accomplish their required duties as far as knowing where the money's going, or is there going to be more than that? Who's going to carry insurance? Probably you're going to have at a minimum general liability insurance. Who's going to be responsible for that? Ownership of assets. This project may be producing greenhouses, may be producing other items of value. Who owns that if something goes wrong? If the project wants to branch off and start their own 501c3, they've gotten to a point, who's going to own that property? Also, who's going to own the intellectual property that's produced? If you have curriculum, if you have a logo that's gotten some, name recognition, that's built up some goodwill with it, those sort of intangible assets, you need to figure out who's going to own that as well. Figuring that out in advance can really help you avoid problems down the road. And then finally, obviously, you want to say, how long is this relationship going to last? Is it going to be a year? Is it going to be renewable? How will we terminate it if somebody wants out? What will those provisions be? So things you need to just generally keep in mind. The missions must be consistent, like I said. Just because your friend has a 501c3 doesn't mean they can act as your fiscal sponsor. Your missions have to be in line. The sponsor needs to retain control of funds and have oversight over how the project uses them. The sponsor, in most cases, will take a percentage of the donations to cover the risk that they are taking as acting as a fiscal sponsor. And I strongly encourage you to get an written agreement in place. If you are eligible for our services, that is the type of thing that we can help you with, help you draft. That is the end. Here are the resources that I mentioned. I encourage you to grab this sheet as well. But we have time for just a few more questions. Is there anything we haven't covered? Yes?
Okay, I'm going to go back to this nuts and bolts.
Okay, yeah, please do.
We currently are fiscal sponsors of 2 organizations. One, we are a neighborhood association, so our mission is the improvement of our neighborhood, both from a safety issue, a historic issue, general standard of living kind of thing. We're a 501c3. We had a group called the Parents Network that was kind of a loose association of parents who set up play dates, Halloween carnival, that kind of
Raise money
thing.
for the playground.
Okay.
Yeah, so they had gotten to the point where they wanted to do a big project, raise money for their playground, for instance. They asked if we would be their fiscal sponsors so donations could be tax deductible. They had their own bank account before we entered into this agreement. What we did was set up a new bank account that they had to transfer their existing funds into that was, I guess in effect, linked with our bank account so that I, as treasurer, have signature authority and can access all of the information online. I can see the checks they write through there too. I can see the money coming in. But they still maintain their own checkbook so that when people make donations, it goes into their account and checks that they write their treasurer.
So there's no pre-approval process for you to sign off. Okay.
There may be after.
Sounds like there may be now.
After 4 o'clock today, there might be. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to figure out is that supervision, and they do report back to me. Their treasurers do report back to me periodically. Is that enough, or I mean, I would hate to have everything have to run through my bank account and me have to write every single check that goes out, but is that what you're telling me needs to be done?
I think if I were advising you, I would probably tell you the best practice would be to have pre-approval. I mean, the danger there is, they write a bunch of checks and run off and, you never see them again. It sounds like these are people you work closely with, they're in the neighborhood. You can take that into account.
I mean,
Yeah.
in the fiscal sponsorship agreement, could you say disbursements under a certain amount are
Absolutely.
at the discretion
You
of-
can tailor it.
Over a certain amount
Yeah.
require pre-approval? I mean, we could-
You can tailor it to fit your situation. Absolutely. So I'm not saying there's one way you have to do it. You just need to talk that through your organizations and figure out what works the best. Yes?
If I have my 501c3 status and I want to partner like with the city of Atlanta in order to provide services, would that be considered a fiscal?
No. No, you're just talking about a partnership agreement between a 501c3 and a governmental agency to do a program together. Yeah, this is purely a situation when you're dealing with a non-501c3 that needs a 501c3 in order to get donations. Mm-hmm. Yes?
You happen to mention that it's best for the project to be incorporated. Are there certain corporations that are best for that project to be or not be?
Well, generally speaking, for nonprofits, you're going to be a nonprofit corporation, set up as a nonprofit corporation. I think you can set yourself up as an LLC, but it's very unusual. Is that the question? What type of a corporation?
Right, for the project.
What type of an entity?
For the-
Yeah, a nonprofit corporation.
Not 501c3 sponsor, but
Right. Typically, it's going to be a nonprofit corporation.
is it, now there's different types like 501c4 and.
That's, okay, that's not the legal entity as far as corporation, or that's an issue of your IRS status, tax exempt status. We are talking today about 501c3 organizations because those are the only ones that can receive tax deductible donations.
But I'm not referring about the sponsored organization.
Oh, the project? Oh, if the project was a non-501c3?
Right, and you're saying it's best for that project to be incorporated. What type of corporation?
Well, incorporated just means you're a nonprofit corporation. That's a function of state law. Being incorporated, you apply to the Secretary of State's office, Georgia Secretary of State. That's what you're talking about is your exempt status, which is with the IRS. That's a function of federal law.
But the project does not have exempt status, that's required.
Correct. Yeah, if they had exempt status, they wouldn't need a fiscal sponsorship agreement.
Any special type of form that they should have in terms of.
At the state level, when the project decides to incorporate.
I'm saying I think it's a good idea for the project. If I were advising a fiscal sponsor entering into an agreement with a project, I would encourage them to make sure the project is incorporated so that they are a legal entity. That is a nonprofit corporation. So you're incorporated as a Georgia nonprofit with the Georgia Secretary of State's office. Totally separate. Totally separate. 501c3 is with the IRS. When you're starting up as an organization, the first step is to get incorporated in your state, and then you apply to the IRS for tax exempt status. So we're talking about before all that. Let's just get this last question in, then we'll wrap up.
If that project is, we're talking today if that project is a nonprofit, but they're also that you could be a fiscal sponsor. The 501c3 sponsoring organization can be a fiscal sponsor for a nonprofit. No, just only nonprofit. Okay.
Yes. It needs to be a non-profit. Yeah, if you're sponsoring a for-profit, say goodbye to that 501c3.
I guess I was thinking in terms of if you're getting someone who has educational projects or curriculum that you want to use in the schools that's consistent with their mission. And they happen to not be a nonprofit.
You're losing me, but we can talk afterwards. But let me back up for one thing I just said, which is this whole issue of filmmakers and individuals getting fiscal sponsors. I'm not talking about that right now. Yeah. All right, well, I'm available after class. Asia, did you have anything to say to wrap up?
Yes, if you would please take a moment to complete your evaluations and put them on the table. We greatly